The Global South-led organization BRICS has been growing in size and influence, and this has frightened some Western politicians, in particular, US President Donald Trump. After Trump returned to the White House for his second term as US president, he threatened very high tariffs on BRICS, and he claimed that he had destroyed the organization.
Was put there for a bad purpose. And most of those people they don't even want to talk about it now. They're afraid to talk about it because I told them if they want to play games with the dollar, then they're going to be hit with a 100% tariff the day they mention that they want to do it. And they will come back and say, we beg you not to do this. BRICS is dead since I mentioned that. BRICS died the minute I mentioned that. And I remember when Obama and Biden in particular, I guess he said that, they have us over a barrel. They don't have us over a barrel. We have them over a barrel. If BRICS wants to play games, those countries won't trade with us. We won't trade with them. And if any trading gets through, it'll be 100% tariff at least.
Now, Trump's claim that supposedly BRICS is dead thanks to his threats could not be further from the truth. The exact opposite is happening. BRICS is actually growing. In July of 2025, representatives of BRICS countries gathered in Brazil for the first ever summit that featured 10 new partner countries that have been added to BRICS, along with the 10 official members of BRICS. So this was the first BRICS summit that included 20 different countries. The 10 BRICS members are the founding 5, which make up the BRICS acronym, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, plus 5 other members, Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. These countries were added to BRICS in 2024. And then in 2025, the 10 BRICS partner countries that were added are Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Nigeria, Thailand, Uganda, Uzbekistan, and Vietnam. Together, these 20 BRICS countries represent over 2/5 of the entire global economy, 44% of world GDP when you measure their combined gross domestic product at purchasing power parity, PPP. And these 20 BRICS countries have a combined population of 4.5 billion, meaning they represent 56% of the global population, the majority of the world. Now, the 2025 BRICS Summit in Brazil was quite important because it featured the participation for the first time of countries like Vietnam. And the US has been trying to divide China and Vietnam to recruit Vietnam for its new Cold War against Beijing. But in fact, the exact opposite is happening. In fact, at the BRICS Summit, China and Vietnam held bilateral talks, and they agreed to deepen their trade and economic integration. The BRICS Summit also featured the participation of Cuba's president, Miguel Díaz-Canel. And of course, Cuba is a country that has been suffering under illegal US sanctions for decades. For over 60 years, the US has imposed a suffocating blockade on Cuba, trying to crush Cuba's economy. And every single year at the United Nations General Assembly, almost every country on earth votes to condemn the US blockade. And yet the US, in violation of international law, continues to impose this blockade on Cuba. So the fact that BRICS invited Cuba to participate as a partner country is a symbol of how BRICS is trying to create a new kind of world. And the vision that BRICS has for a more multipolar world is very attractive across the global South. And even top US trading partners are now participating in BRICS. So for instance, Mexico, the US neighbor and the number 1 trading partner of the US, participated in the BRICS summit in Brazil. Mexico's progressive president, Claudia Sheinbaum, sent the Mexican Foreign Secretary, Juan Ramón de la Fuente, to Brazil to participate, even though Mexico is not officially a member or a partner. But the fact that Mexico participated was a clear sign to the United States that it's not going to tolerate the US bullying it and other countries. It's clear that the growing influence of BRICS is really upsetting a lot of people in Washington because in response to the successful BRICS summit in Brazil, Donald Trump took to his social media website, Truth Social, and he threatened BRICS. He wrote, quote, "Any country aligning themselves with the anti-American policies of BRICS will be charged an additional 10% tariff. There will be no exceptions to this policy," end quote. Now, this is by no means the first time that Trump has threatened BRICS. In fact, he previously vowed to hit BRICS countries with a tariff of 100%.
If they want to play games with the dollar, then they're going to be hit with a 100% tariff.
But given how disastrous that would be economically for the entire global economy, and in particular for the US, which depends a lot on importing from BRICS countries like China, the largest exporter to the US, Trump backed off on that threat of 100% tariffs, and now he's threatening tariffs of 10% on BRICS countries. But at the same time, I should also make it clear that Trump really doesn't understand what BRICS is, because he threatened BRICS in a White House press conference and he claimed that Spain is part of BRICS, which it is not.
What can we expect of the countries in NATO that spend the least amount of money, like Spain, France, below the 5%?
Spain is very low. And yet, are they a BRICS nation?
What?
They're a BRICS nation, Spain. You know what a BRICS nation is? You'll figure it out. But, and if the BRICS nations want to do that, that's okay, but we're going to put at least a 100% tariff on the business they do with the United States. You know what the BRICS is, right? You guys know.
Brazil.
You know what I'm saying, right? You know what I'm saying.
Now, it's easy to make fun of Donald Trump's extreme ignorance, but the threat posed by the US empire is very real. And BRICS countries have been pushing back against US aggression and hegemony. And at the BRICS summit, a journalist asked Brazil's President Lula da Silva about Trump's threats to impose tariffs on BRICS countries. And Lula shot back and said that Trump is acting like an emperor. This is what the Brazilian president said, quote, "The world has changed. We don't want an emperor. This is a set of countries that wants to find another way of organizing the world from the economic perspective. I think that's why the BRICS are making people uncomfortable," end quote. And when he says making people uncomfortable, he's talking about the imperialist countries of the West that colonized most of the global South and are now frustrated to see how the global South is returning back to this anti-colonialist mantle. And one of the main things that concerns warhawks in Washington is the possibility of de-dollarization. Countries in and around BRICS are seeking alternatives to the US dollar, which has been the dominant global reserve currency for nearly a century. During his presidential campaign in 2024, Trump threatened 100% tariffs on countries that move away from the US dollar.
Many countries are leaving the dollar. They're not going to leave the dollar with me. I'll say, you leave the dollar. You're not doing business with the United States because we're going to put 100% tariff on your goods. Sir, we would like very much to get back to the dollar immediately. Thank you very much. It's so easy. I don't know.
And BRICS has become one of the main platforms pushing for global de-dollarization. In fact, at the BRICS summit, Lula, the Brazilian president, called for de-dollarization. This is what Lula said, quote, "The world needs to find a way that our trade relations don't have to pass through the dollar. Obviously, we have to be responsible about doing that carefully. Our central banks have to discuss it with central banks from other countries. That's something that happens gradually until it's consolidated," end quote. At the BRICS summit, Lula even reiterated his call to create a new global currency. This is what the Brazilian president said, quote, "That's why the debate about the need for a new trade currency is so important. Is it complicated? Yes, I know. There are political challenges. But if we don't find a new formula, we'll end the 21st century the same way we started the 20th, and that won't benefit humanity," end quote. Now, de-dollarization is something that Lula da Silva has been pushing for many years. In fact, in 2023, the Brazilian president took a trip to China, and he went to the headquarters of the BRICS Bank, known as the New Development Bank, which is based in Shanghai. And there, Lula gave a speech calling for global de-dollarization. And the president of the BRICS Bank at the time was Dilma Rousseff, who is the left-wing former president of Brazil from the same Workers' Party of Lula. And under her leadership, the New Development Bank has been pushing for de-dollarization and has been giving out more and more loans in local currencies, in the national currencies of BRICS countries, not the US dollar. This was something that was discussed in detail at the 2025 BRICS Summit in Brazil. Dilma Rousseff, in her capacity as the president of the New Development Bank, announced that 2 new countries had joined the BRICS Bank, the NDB, that is Colombia and Uzbekistan. This is also very symbolic because Colombia has historically been one of the closest US allies in Latin America, but that has gradually changed under the first ever left-wing president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, who has moved Colombia into a more non-aligned position, and he has expressed interest in Colombia joining BRICS, and as a first step, Colombia has now joined the BRICS Bank, the NDB. And by the way, I should mention that just a few days before this BRICS summit was held in Brazil, leaked audio recordings came out that showed how the US government is linked to a right-wing coup plot to overthrow Colombia's democratically elected left-wing president, Gustavo Petro. And of course, there's a very long history of the US government backing coups against democratically elected left-wing leaders in Latin America. In fact, there's a new BRICS partner country, Bolivia, that was a victim of a US-sponsored violent coup in 2019, in which Trump, in his first term, backed the violent overthrow of Bolivia's democratically elected socialist president, Evo Morales, and the US helped to install a right-wing coup regime, but that regime was extremely unpopular and very corrupt, so the right-wing coup regime fell, and in the first democratic election after the coup, the left wing was voted back into power, and the new left-wing president, Luis Arce, has made Bolivia into a BRICS partner country. So these are all clear examples of why so many countries in the global south are interested in joining BRICS and why they want to have a more multipolar world in which the US empire is much weaker and cannot try to destabilize any government it doesn't like, whether or not they were elected by the people of a foreign country. But on that said, I'm going to go back to this issue of de-dollarization, which is of course deeply related, and the comments that were made at the 2025 BRICS Summit by the president of the New Development Bank, the former president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, who, by the way, was also the victim of another US-backed political coup, a judicial coup against the Workers' Party in Brazil that led to the imprisonment of Lula on false charges of corruption that were later completely erased because they had been totally fabricated by US-backed right-wing forces in Brazil. But again, getting back to the main point, at the BRICS Summit, Dilma Rousseff talked about the importance of local currency financing for the BRICS Bank. She noted that it's very risky for developing countries to be overly reliant on the US dollar. And Dilma said, quote, "Any business or government that borrows in foreign currency becomes subject to decisions made by the Federal Reserve or other central banks in developed nations," end quote. She noted that this leads to exchange rate risk. So when the US Federal Reserve raises interest rates to combat inflation, this often leads other currencies in other countries to fall against the US dollar, making it harder for them to pay off their dollar-denominated debt. And as an example of alternatives to this US dollar-dominated order, Dilma pointed to projects that were carried out in Brazil that were funded directly in China's currency, the renminbi or yuan, without the need for the US dollar. So de-dollarization is something that is already happening. However, with that said, I should clarify that in her speech, Dilma Rousseff made it clear that the status of the US dollar as the global reserve currency is not going to disappear overnight. De-dollarization is a gradual process. However, she made it clear that local currency operations will remain an absolute priority, that BRICS seeks to build a, quote, diverse, balanced international financial system, end quote. And she stressed that, quote, the rise of initiatives to expand trade in local currencies is undeniable, and I see that as a positive development, end quote. And de-dollarization was also one of the key issues discussed in the Rio de Janeiro Declaration that was signed by all BRICS members and partners at this summit that was held in Brazil on the 6th of July. Now, this document was very long. It was more than 30 pages, so I don't have time to get to all of it, but I want to look at some of the main points about de-dollarization. The document stressed the importance of the new development bank in expanding its local currency financing, and it also discussed other BRICS initiatives pushing for de-dollarization, including the new investment platform. So this is not just about helping developing countries get access to financing, loans for infrastructure projects and things like that, but this is also a new investment platform, encouraging ways for countries to invest in other BRICS countries using other currencies, not just the US dollar. So this is about not just de-dollarizing international trade, but also de-dollarizing investment. Other points discussed in this lengthy joint declaration were the BRICS Interbank Cooperation Mechanism, which is finding mechanisms of financing in local currencies and connecting the banks of BRICS countries. Furthermore, there is the BRICS Cross-Border Payment Initiative and the BRICS Payment Task Force, which are all finding ways to increase the interoperability of the countries in BRICS so they can de-dollarize their trade and cross-border capital flows. And they noted that they are engaged in, quote, efforts to facilitate fast, low-cost, more accessible, efficient, transparent, and safe cross-border payments among BRICS countries and other nations, and which can support greater trade and investment flows, end quote. Another point they discussed was strengthening the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, the CRA, which is not as well known as the BRICS Bank, the New Development Bank. The NDB was formed as an alternative to the World Bank. The CRA, the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, was formed as an alternative to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. So whereas the New Development Bank provides loans for things like infrastructure projects, the idea of the CRA is to provide short-term liquidity financing like the IMF does. So what does that mean? It means that if a country has a short-term liquidity crisis, if they don't have the foreign currency they need to pay for imports of things like energy and food, and the country could potentially face an economic crisis, the CRA could step in and provide the currency needed to pay for imports, like the IMF does, except the key difference is that the IMF has conditionalities. It makes political and economic demands of countries that are asking for financial assistance from the IMF, from these loans. The IMF demands notorious structural adjustment programs, which include mass privatizations, cutting social spending, these kinds of neoliberal economic policies that benefit US corporations at the expense of poor developing countries. They have to privatize their state-owned enterprises and their infrastructure and sell it off to US corporations and big asset managers like BlackRock. So the IMF is a US-dominated organization. The US is the only country on earth with veto power in both the IMF and the World Bank. Every single head of the World Bank has always been a US citizen, and the head of the IMF has always been a European. These are organizations that are entirely dominated by the West. So the idea behind the CRA and the NDB is that BRICS created these organizations to truly serve the needs of the global South, and they don't have conditionalities. They don't have economic and political demands. and they don't impose structural adjustment on countries that are borrowing from them, which is why they are seen as important alternatives in the global south. And although they're still relatively new and relatively small, they are growing in influence. And it's clear that BRICS has made it into a priority to strengthen these organizations and to push for de-dollarization and to offer lending, short-term lending for liquidity and long-term lending for loans for infrastructure projects. And it's doing it in local currencies and national currencies, not just the US dollar. So what all of this illustrates is that BRICS is deeply committed to creating a new international financial and monetary system that is not entirely dominated by one country, like the current US-dominated international financial system. And a big part of that is de-dollarization. Again, this is going to be a gradual process, but it's something that is being discussed more and more. And while Lula and some other leaders are calling for the creation of a new global currency to challenge the dollar, that is a more long-term project. In the short term, what BRICS is already doing is encouraging BRICS members and partners to trade with each other in their local currencies. In fact, Brazil and China have already signed an agreement to trade using the Brazilian real and the Chinese renminbi or yuan. And many other BRICS countries have signed similar agreements for trade in local currencies. And this is also a point that was heavily emphasized by Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, in the speech that he gave at the BRICS summit, and he talked about the need for de-dollarization. Now, by the way, this brings me to a point that I wanted to address, which is that Putin did not physically attend the BRICS summit in Brazil. Instead, he spoke via video link. And the fact that Putin was not there and that China's President Xi Jinping did not physically attend the summit either has been used by Western critics of BRICS and the Western corporate media to claim that supposedly BRICS is dysfunctional, there are all these internal fights going on, that China and Russia are unpopular. That's not what's happening at all. Now, Putin also did not physically attend the BRICS summit that was held in Johannesburg, South Africa in 2023. And this is because of the arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court, the ICC, over the war in Ukraine. And Russia did not want to put other BRICS countries into a difficult diplomatic situation because other BRICS countries are members of the ICC. So that's why Putin decided not to attend either of these two summits. Although I should point out the extreme hypocrisy of the ICC, because Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has an outstanding arrest warrant over the crimes against humanity that Israel has committed with US support in Gaza. And yet no other country has arrested Netanyahu, despite the fact that Netanyahu crossed over the airspace of numerous European countries that are parties to the ICC. And they did nothing to stop him as Netanyahu traveled to Washington to meet with Donald Trump to discuss how they can continue to wage war on Iran. And by the way, Iran has officially been a member of BRICS as of 2024. But this also led to another talking point in the Western media about how supposedly BRICS is divided. And that is that Iran's president, Masoud Pezeshkian, also did not attend the BRICS summit that was held in Brazil. But I think this is pretty obvious. It's not because of internal fighting in BRICS. It's because the US and Israel were waging war on Iran in June, and Iran knows that the US and Israel could wage war on Iran any day now, continuing this war that really did not end. There was only a pause, a temporary ceasefire, and the Iranian president was concerned that he could be assassinated or targeted, or the US and Israel could restart the war while he's traveling to Brazil. So obviously, this is why he wasn't there at the BRICS summit. It's not because supposedly of all this infighting that the Western media wants us to believe is supposedly happening. And although I shouldn't waste much more time responding to these disingenuous Western media criticisms of BRICS, I should point out that the fact that China's President Xi Jinping did not attend could be seen as a strategic diplomatic move by China. It's certainly not a symbol that Beijing does not consider BRICS to be important. In fact, China sent the second most important official after Xi, who is Li Qiang, who is the premier of China, the second top official in China. But the way that I read this decision by Xi not to attend the summit is, I think, actually a sign that China wants the world to see BRICS as a true multilateral organization of the global South and not a China-led organization. Because what you often hear from Western critics of BRICS is that actually this is just a bunch of countries coming together under China's leadership, and supposedly China wants to replace the US as the new global hegemon. That is not at all what is happening. That's the opposite of what's happening. And the decision by Xi not to travel to the summit could be construed as a subtle message by Beijing that there should be more attention paid to other leaders of BRICS countries, like, for instance, Brazil's president, Lula da Silva, because in 2025, Brazil is the rotating president of BRICS. Every year it rotates to a different member of BRICS. So China is saying, look, this is not just about us. There are many other countries and members in BRICS, and we are all part of the family of the global South. This is not just about China and Russia and Iran, although of course they are important members in BRICS. But again, instead of spending my time responding to bad faith Western criticism of BRICS, I want to highlight some of the comments made by BRICS leaders in which they outline what they think BRICS does, the ideas behind this global South-led organization. I'm looking here at a transcript of some of the speeches that were given by Lula da Silva, the Brazilian president, at the 2025 BRICS summit. I wanted to play some of the video of his remarks, but he was speaking in Portuguese. So here is the English language translation of some of Lula's comments. He said, quote, "BRICS is an indispensable actor in the struggle for a multipolar, less asymmetrical, and more peaceful world," end quote. And then he talked about how the US-dominated international financial system benefits the rich countries of the global North at the expense of the formerly colonized countries of the global South. Lula said that, quote, "The frameworks of the World Bank and the IMF currently support a reverse Marshall Plan where emerging and developing economies essentially finance the more developed world. International aid flows have decreased and debt costs for the poorest countries have soared. The neoliberal model only deepens inequalities," end quote. Now, what Lula is talking about here is the neoliberal logic. That means the market fundamentalist logic of the US-dominated financial system, which is designed in a way that benefits rich capitalist oligarchs at the expense of everyone else. So, for instance, US-dominated financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank have pressured countries in the global South to borrow more and more from private investors in capital markets. And this has meant that now the majority of the debt owed by developing countries, formerly colonized countries, 61% of their debt is owed to private creditors, to big financial firms like BlackRock and other Wall Street financial companies that profit from lending money to global South countries at high interest rates. And then if those countries default, the vulture funds on Wall Street step in and buy up their defaulted, distressed debt for pennies on the dollar. And then they use US courts to blackmail countries to force them to pay these billionaires on Wall Street thousands of % profit on the defaulted bonds they bought. I'm not exaggerating. This is literally what happened to Argentina, and it's what other Wall Street billionaires have tried to do to developing countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America. And because of this US-dominated financial system, this has meant that nearly 3/4, 73% of all of the debt owed by Latin American countries is owed to private creditors, largely on Wall Street. This is a system of neocolonialism that benefits a small handful of capitalist oligarchs. And this is why in the speech that Lula da Silva gave at the BRICS summit, he talked about how there is a reverse Marshall Plan, referring to the previous Marshall Plan where the US government lended money to Europe after World War II to fund reconstruction, which also benefited the US because the European economies used the US dollars they received from the US in order to buy US exports. And this strengthened the role of the US dollar as the global reserve currency. And it also prevented European countries from going socialist and allying with the Soviet Union. This was the beginning of the first Cold War. So Lula is now saying that the US and these US-dominated financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank have been overseeing a reverse Marshall Plan where the poor, formerly colonized countries are effectively funding the rich colonizing countries, the Western imperialist countries, and this has benefited a small handful of capitalist oligarchs. And Lula da Silva directly made this link. He pointed out that 3,000 billionaires, 0.00001% of the global population, have earned $6.5 trillion of wealth in the past decade, since 2015. So the rich have gotten much, much, much richer at the expense of everyone else. And this is why Lula used his speech at the BRICS summit to call for tax justice and the fight against tax evasion, saying this is essential and the BRICS countries need to come together to tax billionaires and to have a more equitable international financial system that doesn't just benefit the rich capitalist oligarchs on Wall Street, which is what the current financial system does. So what this shows is that BRICS is not just about de-dollarization. This is about something much bigger. This is about decolonization. This is about the formerly colonized countries of the global south creating a new economic, financial, and political order in which they are equal, truly equal, and the Western imperial countries that colonize most of the world lose the exorbitant privilege they have. It's not just the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar. It's about ending neo-colonialism. And in that vein, I want to play some clips of another speech that was given at the BRICS summit in Brazil by the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim. Now, Malaysia is a major country in Southeast Asia, and it has officially become a partner country of BRICS as of 2025. And in this speech given by Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar, he emphasized how BRICS follows in the footsteps of the non-aligned movement, which was formed by leftist anti-colonial governments during the first Cold War. These were formerly colonized countries, and they came together to push back against Western imperialism. And they said, we're not going to go along with you in the original first Cold War against the Soviet Union and against the socialist countries. The non-aligned movement said, we are going to try to create a new kind of world, a multipolar world, if you will. I mean, multipolarity is a term that's now being used in the 21st century, but it's really the same mission that was being pursued by the non-aligned movement in the 20th century and by leftist, anti-colonialist, socialist leaders like Zhou Enlai in China, like Jawaharlal Nehru, the anti-colonial leader in India, and like Sukarno, the leader of Indonesia. And if you listen to the speech that was given by Anwar, the Malaysian Prime Minister at the BRICS summit, he names those leftist anti-colonial leaders in the global south, and he praises the non-aligned movement.
It is a historic moment. For those of you who have been following the antecedents of history, we realize the attempt to save the voice of newly emerging economies and countries post-colonialism was by Sukarno of Indonesia, Zhou Enlai of China, Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Nkrumah of Africa. It was a bold attempt to ensure that the voice of conscience, those struggling for freedom and justice, is heard. Not much success. It was a bold attempt. Then we have a non-aligned movement proceeding that. We have G77, still not achieving the desired results. Now, I salute you, President Lula, for having the courage to proceed with a clear vision, a clear commitment to voice the concerns, aspirations of the people, particularly of the Global South. We have attempted in ASEAN, other than enhancing inter-ASEAN trade, is even using financial settlement systems. We use our local currency. Of course, we're not talking about de-dollarization because there's a long way to go. But at least we try, Malaysia with Indonesia, Malaysia with Thailand, and together with China, trying to use our own local currency, even beginning with 10 or 20%. It makes a difference because we cannot continue complaining but not executing our own plan in our countries and our friendly neighbors.
In the speech at the BRICS summit, the Malaysian Prime Minister also invoked the 1955 Bandung Conference, in which formerly colonized countries came together and talked about the need to unify the Global South to fight against colonialism. And Anwar Ibrahim explains how back in the 1950s and 60s, during the Bandung Conference, during the founding of the non-aligned movement, these formerly colonized countries were still relatively weak in terms of their economies. They were not developed, they were not industrialized. And now he points out that 60 years later, these countries have come together in BRICS and they have grown a lot economically. They have partially industrialized. They're slowly moving up the value chain in the International Division of Labor, and BRICS can be a platform in which they can work together to create a more multipolar world, following in the footsteps of the non-aligned movement and the Bandung Conference.
But I come back to the major and central issue. BRICS today of 2025 is not the first attempt, the Bandung Conference of 1955. At that time, we were struggling. No industry, no new technology, no competence, except for a united nation, a country, and political leadership. Now, we have political leadership with that vision, and we have strong business community.
Now, I think this is the most important message to come away with after listening to this analysis today, which is that BRICS follows in the footsteps of the Bandung Conference and the non-aligned movement. But it's not just me saying that. It's certainly not just the Malaysian Prime Minister saying that. It was also Brazil's President Lula, who said the same thing in another speech that he gave at the BRICS summit. He noted that the United Nations had been founded in 1945 after the defeat of fascism in World War II, and it was supposed to provide hope for the world and supposed to support decolonization efforts for a more multipolar world. However, Lula warned that on the 80th anniversary of the founding of the UN, quote, "We are witnessing an unprecedented collapse of multilateralism," end quote. And it's the US empire that is spearheading this attack on multipolarity. The US empire is trying to reimpose its unipolar order in which the US treats the entire world as its own kind of colonial sphere of influence. And BRICS is fighting back against US unipolarity and pushing for multipolarity. And as Lula pointed out in this speech, he said, quote, "The Bandung Conference refuted the division of the world into zones of influence and advanced the fight for a multipolar international order," end quote. So that is such an important line. He's saying that multipolarity is not just a new idea of the 21st century. He's saying the Bandung Conference back in 1955, 70 years ago, this is the 70th anniversary. He's saying that was the early attempt to try to create a multipolar world. And then Lula said, quote, "BRICS is an heir of the non-aligned movement," end quote. So again, just like the Prime Minister of Malaysia, the President of Brazil is saying, we are trying to revive the non-aligned movement and the Bandung spirit. And this mission could not be more important and more urgent today Lula underscored in his speech. He discussed how multilateralism is under attack. He said, quote, "International law has become a dead letter, as has the Pacific resolution of controversies. We are before an unprecedented number of conflicts since World War II," end quote. And then he specifically singles out NATO, the US-led imperialist military alliance, and Lula criticized NATO for, quote, "feeding the arms race," end quote. He noted that NATO countries agreed at the NATO summit under pressure by US President Trump to increase their military spending to 5% of GDP, which is more than they spend on education. And Lula pointed out the hypocrisy of these NATO warmongers who are spending 5% of GDP on military, and they're violating their promise to allocate 0.7% of GDP that they had promised for development aid. So after the rich colonial countries of the global north contributed the vast majority of carbon emissions historically that have caused climate change, they're not giving assistance to the countries of the global south that are suffering the worst consequences of climate change. And instead of investing in green energy and green infrastructure, the imperialist countries in NATO are massively expanding their military spending for a new arms race in the new Cold War, Cold War II. So Lula condemned all of that, and the Brazilian government condemned the horrific crimes against humanity carried out by Israel and the US against the Palestinian people in Gaza. Lula called for an end to Israel's illegal occupation and the establishment of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state. And Brazil condemned the violation of Iran's sovereignty and territorial integrity by the US and Israel in their war of aggression. Likewise, Lula criticized the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, and how it's become a political tool that is used to attack Iran and serve US imperial interests. And Lula pointed out that what the US empire is doing is destroying all of these international organizations, including the UN Security Council, where he noted that there is a loss of credibility and paralysis because the US has abused its veto power, preventing any other country from taking an action the US empire doesn't like. So this is why at the BRICS summit, Lula called for a deep transformation of the UN Security Council, a fundamental reform, and the inclusion of new permanent members from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, so the US and the other Western powers can stop monopolizing and dominating these organizations so they're truly democratic, which is really what multipolarity is actually about, global democracy. Because you cannot actually have democracy when the US empire controls all international organizations. They're not truly international when the US has veto power in the Security Council at the UN, in the IMF, in the World Bank, in the World Trade Organization. The US empire has sabotaged all multilateralism in support of unilateralism to try to destroy the multipolar order, to reimpose an imperialist unipolar order, which is really a global dictatorship controlled by the United States and really controlled by Wall Street, because the US government is not a democracy, it is an oligarchy, and it's big capitalist oligarchs, these billionaires that dominate US politics, who fund politicians. There are a dozen billionaires in the Trump administration. Trump himself is a billionaire, and Trump is in fact the perfect symbol of US imperialism. Here you have a racist, xenophobic, ignorant billionaire who's trying to boss around all other countries around the world, who's threatening them with economic war and sanctions and tariffs. And he's trying to destroy BRICS. And he's taking credit for supposedly killing BRICS, which is obviously not true. But the more that Trump and the US empire threaten BRICS, it's only making it clear to countries around the world why BRICS is necessary. And this is why BRICS continues to grow in influence. It's why dozens of countries in the global south are trying to join BRICS. Every year they announce new members and new partners. And this is why this summit that was held in Brazil in 2025, which was the first summit with 10 members and 10 partners, the BRICS 20, This is why these kinds of meetings are so important, because these countries in the global south are coming together to create a more multipolar world, pushing for de-dollarization, pushing for true decolonization to create a democratic multipolar order and to end the neo-colonial order that we still live in today. And it's weakening in influence, it's in decline and in crisis, but this explains why the US empire has been so aggressive in waging war and threatening countries all around the world. And if you want to understand this time of extreme geopolitical conflict, make sure you subscribe here to Geopolitical Economy Report. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief. And here we bring you regular analysis to help you understand what's actually going on and help to inform people and make sense of the rapidly changing global order. So please like and subscribe. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you all next time.